In this section, we're going to talk about the Windows operating system. I am assuming that you are going to be using Windows, as most people are today, and most people doing computer programming are going to be getting into the Windows type programming. So we're going to take a look at how Windows works and what services it offers to you as a computer programmer. Microsoft Windows is an operating system. What that means is that it controls all the operations of your computer hardware. It boots your machine, puts your machine into graphics mode, and then waits for the user to make some input, such as clicking on the mouse or typing on the keyboard. So Windows as an operating system is pretty smart. It can actually check for scheduled events to happen and maybe even turn services off and on for you. Some of the services that Windows performs for you are file services. Files are basically pieces of data that are stored on a computer's hard drive. Basically, you name a file with something that you'll recognize later, and then you put the information into that file name. Now, the OS, the operating system, is what does the actual storing of the information on disk. Now, you may use Word or PowerPoint or Excel to create a file, but when you press that Save button, Word is asking the operating system to save the data. File system types are things like FAT, File Allocation Table, and basically this is a kind of an older mechanism for storing files based on the DOS operating system. Windows 95, Windows 98 are examples of the FAT table storage mechanism. Windows NT uses the NT file system. It stores files in a much smaller and better format than the old FAT table. Now, a file system is organized into a hierarchical structure. It's like an inverted tree with the roots pointing up. You'll have one main root directory, and under that you'll have branches called directories or folders. You can have as many subfolders under each folder as you want. The reason why we're mentioning all of this here is because you realize that when you develop your source code, you're going to want to save this, and you're going to be saving this in some sort of file on the disk. Printing is another service that's performed by Microsoft Windows. It's handled by Windows through printer drivers, and these drivers know how to translate Windows directives into commands that are appropriate for the printer. That means when you write your computer program and you write reports, you'll write them using the Windows printer specification, and that means it'll work on any printer that Windows supports. Networking is another service of Windows. Networking is basically a set of connected computers across a wire, very much like the internet, except usually it's all in one building. This allows you to share files and printers with other people on the network. Now, each computer is actually separate on the network. They each have their own memory, and each memory cannot be shared among computers. The only thing that can be shared among computers is what is actually on the shared disks on the network system. So when you program for a network, you have to take into account that multiple users may be accessing the same information out there under a directory as you are at the same time. Let's talk about some of the different servers and how the different servers work from your standpoint as a computer programmer. Now, a server is really just another computer. A file server is a place where all the common files for your complete network are stored, and that way all the computers connected to this server can share those files. A workstation is nothing more than a computer on the network that is not the central file server. Now, it may be just a standard desktop machine, but it may become also a print server on the network, or maybe even another kind of server like an email or a fax server. But this is just another computer that's hooked up through a wire to the network itself. An application server, this is what you might design. Now, again, it's just another standard computer, but it might hold an application. And other workstations would then connect to this computer to run your particular application. There's also database servers. A database server is another computer that has special software on it that will handle a relational database service. Good examples of these would be SQL Server from Microsoft, Oracle, Sybase, or even Gupta or other relational type database systems. Now let's talk about how Windows works underneath the hood so that you'll get an idea of what you're going to need to do in your computer programming. First off, Windows works on this theory of events. Now what this means is that an event happens whenever something happens in the operating system. For example, a mouse click occurs when you press a key, or maybe a task is scheduled to happen at a certain time of day. This is what's called an event. Now, events are processed through the operating system. The operating system then sends out messages to all the windows that are open within the operating system. And a window would be something like your computer program. So what happens is when Windows sends this message out to the application that is running, it's typically the one that's in the foreground and that has focus at this time. That application then has the ability to respond to that message. This is what's called event-driven programming, because you program your Windows application with little bits of code that will respond to the events and the messages that the operating system sends to you. For example, you click on an OK button. Well, a click event or message is sent to that particular button. Since that's the button that has focus, underneath this button, you'll find that there is code written that will perform some action, like maybe display a dialog box or some other type of event will occur because someone wrote code to make that event happen when that mouse click event got fired. So every bit of code that you write in your Windows application is really dependent on Windows to send it the correct events. Like I said, events happen. So when they happen, you've got to respond to them. So the programming environment that we're going to be dealing with is going to be talking about many different pieces all bundled together. Some of the pieces are the integrated development environment, which is an editor, a debugger, all the related source code files. It'll typically have a compiler and a linker, and then some way to execute that program so that you can test your program right in the programming environment itself. Now, one other very important concept that we need to get down, and that's the concept of a DLL, or a Dynamic Link Library. Now, Windows itself is made up of hundreds of DLLs. Now, basically, a DLL is a set of pre-compiled functions that somebody else has written as a computer program. But it's not a program that runs in the foreground. It's basically something in the background that we can call from our applications, and they're loaded up when we need them and when we call them. And they can also be used by a lot of other applications. So these DLLs are going to become very important in your application programming because they're going to allow you to reuse functionality that's already out there that you would otherwise have to reinvent. Well, in this section, we learned a lot about the Windows operating system. We talked about the services that it offers and how it's going to be used by you as an application programmer in responding to events and using this event-driven programming paradigm.